So if we open this up, there's a it's a folder.
This is why you're testing in Postman.
Yes,
Why
exactly.
You're like, oh, what? Oops, I messed up the name. This is just totally part of the debugging process.
It's time for the DevCast, brought to you by Portage Bay Solutions and all of your professional developers working in the FileMaker space. My name's Dan Smiley. I'm your host and citizen developer. And with us, we have John Newhoff, founder and president. Welcome, John. What's new with you today?
Oh, not much new today. Enjoying some cloudy weather for a change. I'm hoping to go for a little bit of a quick flight after this to visit somebody over in Port Townsend.
Oh, that sounds exciting. And then we have Brad Stanford. Welcome.
Hello.
Kate, good to see you today. We're working on a great app for Wismic. I think we're going to talk after this on that, so we'll get all nerdy with that. What are you up to today?
Just enjoying some rainy weather, and
it's raining in Texas.
Raining in Texas.
I didn't know Texas ever got rain. I thought it was just
tomorrow's gonna be rainy and 90 degrees, which is a recipe for hail. So we'll probably have a hailstorm, which means my husband will jump to work. So there we go.
Okay.
By the way, she has rain down there right now. I got nothing up here. I'm in the north central part of the state, so multiple weather systems.
It is a big state.
It's very big.
So you're up there in the Panhandle?
No, I'm down north central. I'm just off of the side of Fort Worth by about an hour and a half, so southwest of there. So I'm very central. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Jacob, steely-eyed missile man, managed to fix that pesky AIS issue. So I'm so excited about.
Yes.
How are you today?
Pretty good. It's nice California weather and enjoying the morning.
Where are you located?
Southern California, in the high desert.
Okay, I hear your water reservoir is full.
Yes. All the water reservoirs are full. They're probably going to overfill Big Bear Lake's dam. They're going to have to release it this year, probably. All the snow melt. It's there's a lot of water. We actually have rivers. The rivers are running here in the high desert, and they haven't been for like 3 or 4 years. So it's a surprise.
Yeah, Mother Nature has given the state a little runway, to borrow a business buzz term of the decade. Joe, how are you today? Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm great. Great. It's nice and I'm in Nebraska, and we're gonna have our first 70-degree day of the year. We're gonna have 50-mile-an-hour winds, but I don't care. I'm gonna be in 70 degrees.
Right. So you're gonna go drag the laptop and sit outside and
something. Just got to get out there, blow in the wind. I don't care.
That exactly. And Zandon, how's your weather?
It's doing good. I'm in Selah, Washington today, so I had a beautiful sunrise. Stuff we don't get sometimes in Seattle.
Oh, is that not your normal location?
No, I'm over at my girlfriend's house. Her little daughter turned 5 yesterday, so we had a birthday party. Pretty exciting. And Selah, it's next to Yakima, so.
Okay, right. I'm down here in Camas on the edge of the Columbia River. And
nice.
We got a good sunset here today as well. Well, our topic today is Postman integration. And I'm going to start with Zandon just to tell us briefly, what is Postman? Give us an overview.
Postman is exactly what it sounds like. It allows to do REST API calls like post, put, get, and it just makes it easier. So you can store different collections, is what they're called, of different posts, gets, and structure them so that you can retain them and test and see what your input and output is going to be. And super, super helpful, super handy. And I think I could let Joe speak a little bit more to it than that, but yeah, that's pretty much it. They call it Postman. I'm not sure. I think it's because it's like the mail delivery guy, but yeah.
Okay.
Believe when it was first
They
built.
come in the rain or the sleet or the snow. They deliver every time.
Oh, and that's it. You know, when you're working with FileMaker and you start to work with APIs, you're like pulling your hair out sometimes. Like, why am I not getting a response, or am I not authenticating, or what's wrong with my call? You know, my curl call, and Postman just is, you know, made to sort of work with that sort of stuff, so it doesn't have the hurdles that you run into with FileMaker. So putting it in there first, make sure it's working, and then when you take it into FileMaker, you have a model that you can work from, and it makes, you know, all your development in FileMaker so much easier.
So tell us more, Joe. Why should we? Do you use this regularly? Is this part of your
when I'm
regular
doing
workflow?
API integrations? Yeah, it's kind of a must-have. I feel like getting that your API calls just set up and defined in Postman gives you a great reference when migrating that over FileMaker, and we'll go over that a little bit more in depth. But for the most part, it's just a really nice, easy environment to set up, test your calls, test your authentication, make sure the API is set up the way it's supposed to, and then from there you start the integration into FileMaker.
So from an ignorant citizen developer perspective, is this an external tool I use while I'm setting up my FileMaker app? Is this a plugin? How does this integrate with FileMaker?
Great question. So it's a third-party app, so it's completely separate from FileMaker. Postman.com, you can download Postman, the application there, or you can use it in the browser. I've found that storing things locally in my Postman collections makes it a lot easier. I don't have to worry about just latency or, you know, browser compatibility. And so I can set up my calls in, you know, in any form, and I could even, you know, there's options for sharing out your collections and collaborating with coworkers. But I typically just use it as my tool. It's free, so I use it as a tool to set up the calls of how I want them to look and work in FileMaker, and then test that everything works, and then rebuild all the calls in FileMaker using what Postman gives me.
Okay, so that's great. John, did you want to share your screen? Do we want to walk through this?
I think we got Joe poised for screen sharing.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe, would you be comfortable calling it a fill-in-the-blank version of API testing? Would that be okay to say?
Fill in the blank. Well, it's more. It depends on how you use it. Because, and we'll get into this some more, but because Amazon is so thorough with their documentation and with their Postman collections, it's really just plugging in what they've already generated and setting up your authentication and just seeing if your account is set up. There are other APIs where the documentation is not as thorough, or there is no Postman collection to be used. So you have to read through the documentation, and then at that point, it's more of a fill in the blank where you just have to see, you know, put in data at different spots and see if things work. So this one, the S3 integration is much more straightforward because Amazon is so thorough.
Gotcha.
I think to me, an analogy may not work for everybody, but for me, a really good analogy for why Postman is super handy is if you're familiar with doing SQL in FileMaker, SQL in FileMaker is a little bit challenging because you have to encode your SQL queries in the calculation engine, and there's a lot of overhead associated with table naming and quoting and all that. If you're making a SQL query in a simple SQL tool like Razor SQL on the Mac or Microsoft's Query Analyzer, you're just typing pure SQL, and it's super easy to determine whether or not your SQL is correct or not. So if you do it there first and then put it in FileMaker after you know you've got a good working SQL query, it makes it a lot easier. And I feel like Postman's similar. If you do it in Postman first to make sure everything's working correctly, or you put it in FileMaker, you're streamlining things a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
And just to add,
yeah, go ahead, Kate.
One more point is that, you know, it's not strictly for FileMaker. I mean, we're really talking about anytime you're working with an API, And now as the Claris platform grows, as we get this ability to build our own custom connectors in Claris Connect, that's really specifically, okay, you need to know how this API works, need to test all the calls. So this would also be a really valuable tool for working with any API via Claris Connect, FileMaker, Claris Pro, maybe Claris Studio in the future. Who knows? I think this does really serve as a very valuable tool for the future of the Claris platform.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, even using Postman to make calls to the FileMaker data API. There's even tools to, and I haven't gone this far with Postman, but you can run entire processes where you're calling multiple APIs and passing data between them just to test that workflows work. So there's all sorts of tools built in Postman that you can really integrate all sorts of different APIs and workflows. So it's a pretty massive tool.
Yeah, it's even got its own scripting.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yep. It is really cool.
Another script language I need to learn.
Right.
But for today, we won't touch any of that. We're just going to go through the process of setting up a workspace, importing in the collection, and the basic authentication model, and making our first calls, and then seeing how that translates into what we're going to need to store in FileMaker to build the API call from the solution. So this is a pretty standard API integration. There's nothing outside of the authentication, and we are using S3, so there's calls specific to S3, like uploading data and things like that. But other APIs are typically sending data or getting data. We're not typically in the form of JSON objects or things like that, or using text. So this one's a little bit different because we're using actual files, but for the most part, it's a pretty standard integration. Now, I wanted to at least start off. I'm forcing myself to not be as prepared as I would like. I'm going to start with a blank slate. We're going to create the collection, import the entire collection from Postman's the S3 collection from Postman, and then set up the authentication, set up the call, and I'm going to see if I can do it without forgetting anything.
And all in 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, the clock is running.
It's okay, Joe. We'll fix it in post.
Okay, so I have a number of workspaces here. I have an AWS workspace. I've cleared everything out, so nothing's in here. Just a quick overview of the interface. I also use dark mode in all my things, so there's that. If you're seeing different stuff, the light mode just looks different. Let me move my zoom controls out of the way. Okay. So,
can I pause you there for a second? Joe, you mentioned S3. What is that before we get any farther?
S3 is Amazon's storage platform. So, I know.
I can speak to it if you'd like.
I was going to say, I know enough to be deadly, but Xandon has all sorts of information about it.
Yeah, so all of your different cloud providers offer a way to store information. There's structured file format, where you like your hard drive on your computer, and then there's what's called containerized object storage. And so an S3 is a container. You basically put objects in containers called what's called a bucket, and an object is basically that. It's an object similar to it can be a file, it can be a graphic, it can be just a blurb of text. Basically, any type of file can be put into an S3 bucket. And it has a little bit of information about it, but you're not putting it into a structured file system. You don't have folders or anything like that. It just gets put in there, and it has a reference. And you can connect to that reference across the internet from anywhere, or you can connect locally through private addresses. So it gives you this place to store shared information in the cloud, and it's scalable, hugely scalable and accessible. And those are sort of the key things that you can't do with structured data, because you have to sync data across different regions in order to make it available in different locations. well, all sorts of different problems there. But yeah, and storage on it anywhere from 0 bytes to 5 terabytes. So you can go pretty big. And there's all sorts of data redundancy. It's got a really high uptime, it's got all sorts of wonderful things. So
would you say that S3 is probably the most common cloud container storage, or?
Yeah, I believe so by far. I mean, the next would be Google's cloud storage. And then, third up in the line would probably be Microsoft's Azure. But
right.
Yeah, everybody wants it, right? And they don't, it's funny, the pricing model in it is like, it's almost free. It's pretty much free to put anything you want in your S3 bucket. And then you get charged for pulling things out. So they want you to push stuff into the S3 bucket. And then they charge for the pulling out information.
Well, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
So Joe, you're using S3 as the storage for the Postman solution you're going to work with right now.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So we're going to be integrating a FileMaker solution to store data, particularly images, into S3, and then it's going to reference those files stored in S3 throughout the solution, all over the place. So the first bit is just getting this set up, setting up the connection between FileMaker and S3, and we're going to use Postman to test all of the calls and authentication. And so let's go and start that out. So in other APIs where you don't have a very thorough collection, what you do is start a new collection and build it from there. The nice thing about Amazon is all their collections are very tidy, and they're all a free download directly from their website. Now, I can show you quickly what that looks like, but this is what their guide looks like. And I've spent some time going through the guide. It is helpful when you're learning a new API integration to review the documentation, familiarize yourself with it. You don't need to memorize it. You just need to know where to find things. And typically they're all in one place. Amazon, like I was saying, is very thorough. So very easy to find all their calls, very easy to understand what their authentication looks like, and just get it working pretty quickly. So let's go. We've got our this is their Postman's collection for Amazon, which has been made by Amazon.
You define collection, Joe?
The collection is all of the API calls that are available for that API. So when you download a collection from Postman, there's a good chance it's gonna include way more than what you need. But it has every possible call defined in the collection itself, and it's all very organized in a folder form. So you've just got the entire list of necessary variables and all sorts of stuff for each call.
Yeah, only for the collections that exist, right?
Yes, for all the collections that exist.
Yeah.
And if you look at the collections, they will match up with the documentation. Typically, I have worked with collections that were completely different than the documentation, so you have to work your way around that. Some of them are not updated by the actual provider of the API, so but that's pretty rare these days. I'd say in the early days of API integration, everything was on the fly. You were just making up stuff left and right. But these days, collections are very thorough, and when you're working with larger companies like Google and Amazon, their collections are built by, you can tell they're built by developers. They're just so well thought out. So I've downloaded the collection for S3. It's down here towards the bottom, and what we're going to do is just import it directly in to this new collection. So I've got it in my downloads, and I'm just going to drop it in. It's a JSON file, which is just a JSON object with all the calls built into it. So there, it's imported, and we've got our list of calls. So integrating with buckets, these are all of the calls to do that. And integrating with objects, which termage for verbiage, the term object is any endpoint that's going to be in a bucket. So the file that's going to exist at the endpoint is going to be your object. And then there's the public access block, which that's a whole series of access API calls, and we won't get into that. So all we're working with today is we're going to view the buckets, make sure that we can view the buckets, and then upload a file. So buckets in S3 are essentially the parent folder that's going to store all of the objects with it, and then you can add folders, things like that. But it's going to inherit every object within this bucket is going to inherit the permissions for that bucket. And then there are additional permissions for each file and so on and so forth. We won't get into any of that. We're just going to test our initial API call by seeing if we can get all the buckets in this account. We have a Portage Bay S3 account, and we have a few buckets in there. So I took, I just made one of them public for this demo, and so we can at least view that, get the list of buckets, and then see, and then post files to that public bucket. So
you chose the top secret bucket, right? That's the one that you made public.
Always, yeah.
Good.
You just want to share everything all the time.
Good man.
Be transparent.
Yeah, and the fun part about S3 is if you're logged into your AWS console account and you pull up the Postman and you download the bucket to Postman, it'll automatically come in with your keys. So you don't have to.
That's where I was just going. So thank you for
that. That makes it sound like a hacker tool.
Yeah. I mean, it has
well, if you have those credentials, I mean,
right.
Yeah.
You're already in.
You're
You're already in the system.
Right. Exactly. So now, because I was already logged in, I have my access keys and secret keys. These I also created just for this demo. This is a one-off access key that I've created in our Amazon keys, or in my IAM account.
Yeah. Wait. Stay there a second. I'm writing those down. We're gonna blur those out.
It'll
right?
be gone, and it'll be gone soon enough. But what's nice about that is that since I was already logged in, it automatically added my keys to this. And so what I like to do first, right off the bat, is set up my environment. Your environment is all of your variables that you're going to use for each call. So for this particular call, I'm going to need to make this access key and secret key into variables. So the nice thing about Postman is I can click them and just choose set as variable. We'll set a new variable. This is going to be my access key. Puts the value, and then the scope is where do you want to store that. So a global variable, just like in FileMaker, is a variable that it can be used within all the collections of your workspace. I just want to save it to this particular collection, so that way I don't accidentally use different names, to have duplicate names between collections, and it just gets confusing. So I typically always save it to the collection. So we've got our scope is in this collection, and we've got our access key variable, and there we go. It defined it for me. And then we'll do the same thing with all the other necessary variables.
This is one of the things I really like about Postman.
Yeah.
Is how easy it is to set up.
Yes.
They're not making you go to the variable screen and enter a new one and all that kind of stuff. You just do it on the fly. So easy.
Yep. Their authentication models are fantastic. The fact that they build them all into Postman and then update your headers in the call accordingly, that saves so much time. This used to be kind of a black box. You would have to set up your authentication, figure out how the API was connected, but these days they're all defined, so it's super simple. And AWS has their own specific authentication model, and we'll go into the structure of that later on. But the fact that I don't have to build that out here, it just has a screen where I put in the data, and it's good to go. So now these are the headers. It already had defined all these. So typically you don't need to change headers. There are some situations where you're going to add headers, or add key pair values into the headers. If you're doing additional permissions, or if they're usually laid out in the documentation of the API. And so it'll give you additional options if you want to add those, and it'll say if it's required or not. Very, very thought out.
Usually it's in the documentation.
For this one, since we're talking about Amazon S3, I'm just gonna kind of reference that from here on out. The Amazon stuff is very thought out. The body of the post, this is pretty straightforward. It's just an XML body. We don't really need to know what's happening right here, right now, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. And then pre-request script. This is if you do want to run. So earlier when we were talking about the scripting language, this is where you would perform additional scripts before the request was actually sent. And then same thing with tests. You can test for certain scenarios, pre and post call. And then there are additional settings that rarely ever change, but you can, depending on the APIs, you can do redirects or, all sorts of stuff that are defined in the settings tab. So we've got our parameters for this call. We're in the buckets folder, and we're just going to get the list of buckets for our account. I didn't change the URL. I've just added the authorization, and now I got to switch over. Oh, I got to save it, and then.
Would you normally change the URL?
Depending on the call, typically the collections already have the URLs built in, so we typically never have to change those. And if we do, it'll tell you exactly when and where it should be changed. As you can see, my environment has not updated, and I knew I would run into some of these problems. Postman is very well thought out, but there are some, bugs here and there where it's not using the collection that I created.
If you were creating your own API in FileMaker, if you were creating and publishing an API for your solution in FileMaker using the data API, you could write your own. You could create your own collection and publish a Postman collection for your own FileMaker Solutions API if you wanted to, right?
Yes, absolutely.
John, when would you want to do that? Do you write your own APIs for FileMaker Solutions?
Sure. If you've got a solution, and this might apply to vertical market developers, but if you've got a solution where you want to provide access to a third party, and a vertical market developer would be a good example. If they've got 100 clients using their vertical market product for maximizing crop yields on cabbage plantations or something, all those people probably have accounting systems, and their accounting systems might benefit from being able to access the data that's in the FileMaker app, and having a standardized API for that would be a common request. And if those developers are all wanting to use Postman, then providing a Postman collection to them would be you would do that for the same reason Amazon's doing it, to make it easier for your customers to use your API, and therefore get your customers to be more tightly married to your solution. If they've bought your solution, they're committed to it. If they've written third-party tools to your API, they're even more committed to it. And so having a good API, I think, is a tool to help keep your customers happy and keep them committed to your product. It's also a way of providing access to your data in a very structured way. If you're an in-house developer in an enterprise environment, and you need to provide some other developers there, maybe they're developers of in-house intranet solutions, and you need to provide access to your FileMaker data. Doing it through the API, doing it through a custom API that you've written, gives them really structured access to it without having to expose, for example, the ODBC interface, where you lose some control over what people can get to.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so let's make our first call. We'll see if this works. Okay, the access ID provided does not exist in our records.
Anybody have a chant to the demo gods ready?
Let's see here. Let me look at.
And I can backpedal on the environment stuff. The environment stuff is where you can store. So you can have this S3, all of these like credentials and everything, but you could have multiple different variables that you want to share, where there's the server, there's the different credentials that you want to use, and you can store those in the environment. And then so you could have your dev environment, you could have your production environment, and as you're going through and testing, you can quickly change the environment and use the same collection to interface with those different environments. So the environment can be really helpful for being able to sort of separate those different pieces of the puzzle.
One of my questions was about the difference between addressing a sandbox from Postman versus addressing a live account. And if you're testing in a sandbox, how do you make that transition? And I think that answers the question. Is you set up two different environments. You can play around in the sandbox, hence the name sandbox, and then take what you've learned and go live with it.
Yeah, well, and you got to be careful there, because sandbox for some, like Shopify, not Shopify, QuickBooks. The sandbox for QuickBooks is completely different than the production QuickBooks. So you can totally play around in Postman with but yes, very similar. You just have to set up the environments slightly different for each, and yeah, absolutely, it works. But yeah, they can be, the sandboxes can sometimes not be like production, so always be prepared for that when you're integrating your APIs. Sometimes they'll sugarcoat the sandbox so it's super easy for a dev to play around with the calls. And then when you go to production, there's a few more hoops you have to go through in order to get your authentication process in place.
And that's good to know in advance for somebody that's just starting, especially with the QuickBooks, because you and I both touched QuickBooks.
Yeah.
And
you're like, everything's working great in my world. Let's deploy to production. Oh, wait a minute. Why doesn't production work? I didn't have a production account to test with, so that's kind of weird.
Yeah. So anybody that's thinking, oh, I'll just jump into QuickBooks, just know in advance that you're going to have deployment things that you got to work through. But it's the same thing we all work through. It's nothing unique.
Okay, I figured out the authentication. It was using a key that I no longer use. For some reason, it was still using an old key as a default instead of the new key that I had made for the demo. So, but that's also kind of indication that it was able to at least get into the account and see the access keys. So now that I've got the correct access keys entered in as my global variables, and I can verify that here. All I have to do is run this, and it's still saying it doesn't exist. Cool.
Yeah, but this is so much easier to problem solve. If you were trying to do this in FileMaker, you'd have no idea where you were at.
No idea where to get.
It's still override. Even though you pasted in the current one, it still says the current one is the initial one. So you just gotta.
Oh yeah.
Was there a save after you edit the variables?
The collection, you got to reset the initial.
It says current value right there. It's just maybe just change the initial value. I don't know.
Yeah, I could do that. Oh, okay.
Great example of debugging and troubleshooting.
Okay, so now
multiple sets of eyes. If we all work together, it's like, oh, I see that. Because for Joe, he has the hardest part because it's like all eyes are on him. He's controlling the mouse.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I hope you used industrial strength antiperspirant this morning.
Hey, that's a great lead into our sponsor for this presentation. Joe, could you take that away with the
right.
What deodorant are you using today?
Are you afraid of stinking at work?
By yourself in your home office?
Right. Has your cat run away from you?
Okay, so we made our first successful call. So all we want to do is get a list of all the buckets in our account. And we have our access key set up, secret key set up. We can see our response status. This is in the header of the call itself, is 200. Okay, so that's the call you're always looking for in every API call. The response should always be 200. Even if it's an error, you want a 200 response because that means the API server was able to process the call. If there's any other error here, that'll be specific to to the header itself. So it's like permission denied or invalid body or something along that terms. If the server can receive the call and process the data in it, then the response should be 200. Okay.
Unless you're working with QuickBooks, in which case you might get it 100 as a response, but that's a totally valid response.
Yeah. So we've got our list of buckets. These are the 3 buckets in our account. We can, if we want to, we can go further and view permissions for each bucket and all that sort of stuff. But that's all we wanted to do. That's our first call to the API. So in FileMaker, we would, if we needed to get a list of all the buckets in the FileMaker solution, we would perform the same call. So to go a little bit further into that, this is what the curl request looks like. There's a tab on the right in Postman, to get you these code snippets. And our headers in FileMaker will have to be rebuilt in the same function. So when you're doing insert from URL calls in FileMaker, you just use the post. So this is the command line curl. We would use a post and then set up the headers, and they would all look like this. Now, if we wanted to, we could just copy these exact values and put them into the curl options for the insert from URL call and just test that it worked. But to be more thorough in the solution, we would want to store specific variables and then build the headers into the insert from URL call. So typically you would do that in its own set variable, and the variable would be, curl options or whatever. And then you would build your headers in that variable.
Is this one of those scenarios where you copy this text, you paste it into FileMaker, and it suddenly fills it with gobbledygook because it's looking for either field names or literals? Is that the scenario we're in?
Yes, in a certain aspect, you do have to watch out for quotes, escaping those, things like that. Postman, most API calls use like single quotes around specific variable or specific values, so it makes it a little bit easier. But as you can see in the data, there are quotes in the version, so you'll have to escape those.
So Jacob, any tools to use to cheat for us?
I mean, you could cheat by using insert text and exactly match it.
That's it.
Insert text is no longer a cheat. It is the go-to syntax call.
I mean, it would perform the call, but like Joe was saying, you probably want to store everything later. So
yeah, exactly. So that's the first call out of the way. So we know our authentication works. We know we can view what we need to from within S3, and that's kind of your first roadblock, right? So now we can move on to the main function we wanted to do, which was putting a file into S3. So for this demo, we're going to be using this PBS share bucket. And then now we're going to go over to our objects, and because I know where to go, we're going to use the put the copy object. And so prior to this, I had read through the documentation and got a better idea of all their terms. So I already knew where to go for this one. But in general, you want to spend a while reading through as much of the documentation as possible. Maybe looking up some forum posts. Typically, there's a like a community page where people can post questions for whatever API. Otherwise, use your other greatest resource as a developer, which is your ability to Google search. Okay, so we're going to be copying a local file to S3. As you can see, I pulled up the copy object API call in the URL. You can see there's a couple of variables that are unresolved, and so we need to create variables in place of, or define what these variables are going to be in the URL call. So we know that the bucket is the last one from the last call, the last bucket. So we're going to add this. The value is going to be the PBS share, and a scope is in the collection. We can get into a whole sub conversation about where to store variables. For this demo, I'm just putting them into the collection. I typically like to put them in their own specific environment variables and have them separated out and easy access. But for the demo, we just have it here, and they're easily changeable. So, yeah, that's. I know I get weird about variables, and I know other developers do too. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Okay, so our variable for the bucket's been defined. The key is going to be the value that the name of the file. So it can be anything you want. For this demo, we'll just set a variable as test file. Oh, no. Variable test file. Okay, so now the variables are not highlighted red, so we know they're defined. We can hover over them, we can see them in the collection itself. So pretty straightforward. Our authorization, as you can see, the collection already had these defined, and that's not the variable names that we're using. So we just need to swap these out for the correct variable.
Yeah, which is sometimes helpful when you're going through it, looking at it really quick just to see what preloaded variables are. So when you're setting your collection variables, you can use their already named, and then they'll just automatically pick up and populate properly.
Yep. It's really, really handy.
But changing after the fact, not a big deal either.
Yeah. Region, typically you're always using one region when you're making a call to an API. If you've got multiple regions, they each have different authentication, so there's a whole other thing involved with that. For now, I'm just going to put in the region for this demo, which is, if you go back over to share properties, US West 2.
That's specific to AWS. You wouldn't have that parameter with other APIs typically, right?
Correct, right. Just for the AWS API calls, we need to define the regions.
And that's because you're using the AWS signature, which is like its own authorization process. Yeah.
Yep. And then if you look in here, there's a whole the checksum algorithms for defining your string or defining the string that is the checksum algorithm. That's included in with that header object. So there's a lot of that's all part of the integration or the authentication stuff that you would want to at least dive into a little bit before you start making calls. Just familiarize yourself with it. You don't have to know exactly how everything's supposed to work. So, okay, so we have our variables set up. Our header is auto-populated. The body of it is going to be so for this, it didn't automatically change the body type. So I'm going to do that instead. And since I read through some of the documentation, we don't want raw raw body object. We need it to be binary because we're going to be uploading a file. So I will define the file. I'm just using our logo image. And then same thing. We don't need any pre-request scripts or tests, and we don't need to change any of the settings. So now we're going to be putting this file into this bucket. So the URL is, well, I'll just run it and kind of show you what it does. The bucket or attempting to access must be addressed using this specific specified endpoint. So all feature requests to this endpoint. And so the endpoint should look like this: pbsshare.s3.amazonaws.com, rather than this. So since the collection does not have the bucket names, defined when you download it, this is kind of an expected error. So we know that now we need to change this, and because we're using variables, what we'll do is put the variable name here. Why didn't it? Oh, okay. Remove it from this side of the URL. And then okay, so we've got a status of 200.
And those endpoints are described in the documentation. There's a path, and then there's a virtual path. So they're just two different ways. This is for AWS.
Yep.
But this is the power of Postman right here. I mean, you have the message down there right in the same screen as where you're playing, where you're testing.
Exactly.
And it was just a copy and paste to fix it, right? And that's so nice.
Yep. Exactly. So we've got our response. So we've got our ID of the transaction itself, the request ID, the timestamp, the encryption, and the e-tag for this call, and then the server and content link. Because we're uploading a file, there was no content link. The code, for the call itself. So if I close it back out, this code icon on the right. This is the request that we're going to be rebuilding in FileMaker. So in the curl options, we're going to be building this exact. The variable will look basically exactly like this. So it'll say post, and then we build everything out.
Joe, do you typically take this code straight into FileMaker and use it just to get a correct answer, like establish that yes, it's working from FileMaker, rather than setting variables and all the things that we typically do to make non-brittle code? Do you just say, let's just see that it works, and then we'll start parting out the parts?
Sometimes, because Amazon stuff is so thorough, I already know what variables I need to be saving into the solution. So you've got a preferences table, most likely. You're putting all your keys and your authentication in there. And then you're defining, you've got a URL field, all sorts of stuff like that. But an easy way to test would just be to dump this entire thing into a variable and then make the call and see what kind of response you get. That's a good starting point. It's not going to work, guaranteed. It's not going to work every time. You're setting up spaces, quote, you got to figure out just get the format right. For some reason, FileMaker will change the call or alter that call in some way, and so you have to massage it a little bit to get it to work. Okay, it's just kind of an expected scenario.
So maybe in the future we could do a demo where we take this bit of code and actually drop it into FileMaker. And complete the thing, but not today.
Structure, I don't have enough having a template
for that one today.
That's where having a template sort of for FileMaker to be able to load these values in with a proven template that is going to work really handy. But that's a whole nother.
So Joe,
do you want to show the? Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kate.
Well, should we see the uploaded image? It actually made it. Should we see it?
Yeah. So that was the next bit.
Okay.
Do you have a question before I get to that?
No, go ahead. Go ahead and do that. Yeah.
Okay. So we have our curl. We have, proper response. Let's go and see what that file looks like in S3. So we've got our this is the bucket. and we've got our test file here, and I accidentally threw a, you can see in the URL, I have a / in there that should not be there, but now that's the name of the file. So if we open this up, there's a it's a folder.
This is why you're testing in Postman.
Yes, exactly.
You're like, oh, what? Oops, I messed up the name. Like this is totally part of the debugging process. Like,
so if I remove that / send it again, got a response, and then we go back to the objects.
Nice 200.
There we go.
Okay.
That's the file itself. So we've got the properties for this file. Pretty straightforward stuff here. This is the URL, the endpoint for this file. Actually, let me make sure it inherited permissions. Yep. So now I should just be able to do this, and it gave me access denied. Oh, it's because it didn't set all those globals. So let's do that. Oh, not that. Okay. So changes.
And you do want to be careful with these permissions because you are opening it up to the world.
Right.
But
remove right there. Yeah. To the right.
Oh.
Unless you want. Yeah. There you go. And then save.
Okay, so now there it is. Now I can take this, and I've got a actual. So one thing I highly recommend for all developers is to just have a local FileMaker file for dumping random code into and seeing if it works. And I do that all the time. This is my test file. It looks like absolute hell, but it does all the functions, and it takes the brunt force of all of the things that I throw at it. So I can throw, this in there, and I can view it in FileMaker. I know this web viewer is pointing to this endpoint, and that's it, right? Like that's our first big success. Now we have to migrate it into FileMaker, and then we'll do that another day.
So can I use this to basically turn my FileMaker solution into my own little version of Dropbox?
Well, S3 would essentially be your Dropbox. You can actually do this with Dropbox. Dropbox does allow you to have an API, and you can upload files to that API. I wouldn't say it's nearly as thorough. In the little bit that I've used it, it's not nearly as thorough as Amazon's, but you can do this exact thing. So
does Postman have the stuff I need to do what we just did with Amazon in Dropbox?
Dropbox would have it. I haven't looked, but I imagine someone at Dropbox has made a Dropbox collection, or has made a collection that you could import into Postman from their website. So,
all right, well, I'll make a note of that. Kate, make a note of that. We might have. I think we might have a use case for this.
Well, and this is based off a real client because they, FileMaker, of course, has external storage. So they can, you can just use FileMaker's storage for container fields, but there could be limitations to that, especially if you're dealing with really large amounts of data. And as this client was, so it was important to, they didn't want to have to rely on having all that space on their local server or on a third-party server. So they, were using S3 as the solution here, and just it's cheaper, storage, and in some ways more reliable. I mean, piggybacking on everything that Zandon said, and yeah, once you incorporate the API, you can go ahead and tie it all together. So
Jacob, could we do this with the AIS app? Could we store the decoded AIS data in this way?
I mean, this is kind of along the lines that we were kind of discussing. I mean, S3 buckets kind of fall into the data lake, or they could fall into the data lake categories, right? I don't know, Sam, you probably know more about the storage limitations of S3, but I believe it's like exabytes, like they're extremely massive. So you probably could. take advantage of storing it there first and then requesting it back instead of storing it all in FileMaker.
Yeah,
like we are.
yeah, and you can do all sorts of triggers and event triggers and stuff on the data once it gets in the S3 bucket to convert it over to the data structure that you'd need to make it easier either to load into FileMaker or to load it into a web app solution. For the image part of it, they also have streaming. You can do, secure real-time viewing of the media and streaming of it. So that works really great if you're doing video.
They have a content. AWS has a content delivery network service as well that ties in with S3 that keeps the content that you want available in different areas around the country for super fast delivery. If you're needing to stream video to different parts of the country and you need it to be fast, I forget what they call that, cloud something, I'm sure.
Cloud
Wow,
share
well, that
or
sounds
something
interesting.
like
But
that.
you know how a lot of AIS apps will allow you to view an image of the ship that you're tracking. So could you use this technique to separately store all those images separate from the rest of the solution? Would that make sense?
It could. I think to me, the question with S3 versus, like, for example, FileMaker external storage. FileMaker external storage is not necessarily even network storage. It's sitting there on the hard drive or SAN or whatever hard drive infrastructure you have on the FileMaker server. The externally stored images are right there. They're accessible at to FileMaker server at possibly SSD speeds, certainly hard drive speeds, and so those images are available just instantaneously. The images in S3 may not be, certainly not instantaneous. So I think it takes some analysis of what you're trying to accomplish about where best to store the images, depending on the amount of storage space needed and how fast you need to be able to grab them. For vessel images, I would say external storage might be better. There aren't that many vessels in the world. Even if there's hundreds of thousands, external storage can take care of that without much trouble. And you probably don't need super high resolution images for that, so the sizes wouldn't be that big. Yeah, that's just all off the top of my head.
Well, that makes sense. It's time. That'll be a discussion for another day. That's really all the time we have for today's podcast. Joe, thank you so much for taking us through the demonstration. Is there any last comment that you want to make that you want people to know about Postman before we go?
No, I know there are other tools similar to Postman that a lot of other developers have recommended, but I haven't had a time to really switch over. It's like learning something new. I know Postman works, it's reliable, so I haven't changed it yet. But there are a number of tools these days for integrating into all sorts of APIs. So familiarize yourself with whatever tool you choose and make it a part of your normal routine.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe, Brad, John, Kate, Joanne, and Jacob. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate the rest of us. And everybody now, go back to work. We're done.
Thank you for spending your time with us at the FileMaker DevCast today. We hope you found something useful, something thought-provoking, and something to take into your own development approach. Things that help you to be more productive and to allow you and your team to get more done in less time. Find us online at portagebay.com and filemakerdevcast.com, and also on social media at FM DevCast and Portage Bay. Let us know if we can help you or your company with modernizing your approaches and streamlining your workflow. We look forward to seeing you at the next DevCast.